Trade Restrictions, Tariffs, Unit 4. Chapter 8 of your e-text. Our conclusion from previous chapters is that countries should export more and import less, if they want to enjoy gains from trade. This conclusion is studied in more detail in this chapter by examination of tariff, which is a government tax on imports to limit them. Most economists favor letting nations trade freely, with few tariffs and other barriers to trade. The striking consensus among different parties in favor of free trade is based on the fact that there are usually net gains from freer trade, both for nations and the world. The main task of this chapter is to compare free trade policies with a wide range of trade barriers. To see what is lost or gained by putting up barriers to trade, the analysis of a classic kind of trade barrier, a tariff on an imported product. This chapter spells out who is likely to gain and who is likely to lose from a tariff and explains conditions under which a nation could end up better off from trade. This slide explains what a tariff is and what are its different kinds. A tariff as a term used in international trade is a tax on importing a good or service in a country, usually collected by customs officials at the place of entry. Tariffs come in two main types. A specific tariff is stipulated as a money amount per unit of import, such as dollars per ton of steel bars, or dollars per 8-cylinder, 2-door sports car. An ad valorem tariff, that is on the value tariff, is a percentage of the estimated market value of the imported good when it reaches the importing country. Compound tariff is when we combine specific and ad valorem tariffs. This chapter discusses how a tariff always lowers world well-being. A tariff lowers the well-being of each nation, including the nation imposing the tariff. The nationally optimal tariff discussed near the end of this chapter is a possible exception to free trade. When a nation can affect the prices at which it trades with foreigners, it can gain from its own tariff and the world as a whole loses. A tariff helps those groups tied closely to the production of import substitutes, even when the tariff is bad for the nation as a whole. By now, we know that tariff is a tax imposed on imports. The question arises, how this tax impacts the production of import competing products and domestic producers. Intuition suggests that domestic producers that compete against imports will benefit from a tariff. If the government places a tax on imports of the product, the domestic price of imported product will rise. Domestic producers can then expand their own production and sales, raise the price they charge, or both. The tariff, by taxing imports to make imports less competitive in the domestic market, should make domestic producers better off. For understanding the effect of tariff on different countries, it's important to be aware of international organizations promoting trade. Early in the chapter, the first in a series of boxes on global governance that introduces the World Trade Organization, created in 1995, which subsumed the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, formed in 1947. The major principles of the WTO include trade liberalization, non-discrimination, and no unfair encouragement of exports. 8 completed rounds of multilateral trade negotiations have been successful in lowering tariffs imposed on most non-agricultural imports into industrialized countries. The box also notes the different path that developing countries have taken to their tariff reductions. This slide shows the agenda we will follow to discuss the effect of tariff on a country's demand and supply. We will start by examining effects of tariff on small country. This small country was introduced to you in the last chapter. A small country is the one whose import policies does not affect the world product prices, and these nations are mostly price takers. Second, we will discuss effect of tariff on large country. A large country is one whose import policies have effect on world product prices and which are mostly price makers. Also, let's recall the concept of consumer surplus and producer surplus used in the very first week. Consumer surplus is the difference between what consumers pay and what they would have been willing to pay. Consumer surplus is the increase in the economic well-being of consumers who are able to buy the product at a market price lower than the highest price that they are willing and able to pay for the product. Producer surplus is the difference between the price that a firm receives and the price it would be willing to sell it at. Producer surplus is the increase in the economic well-being of producers that are able to sell the product at a market price higher than the lowest price that would have drawn out their supply. This slide shows graphical representation of consumer and producer surplus in demand and supply curves. The triangle consumer surplus shows that equilibrium price, that is P1 in the market, was less than what many of the consumers were willing to pay. The triangle producer surplus shows that the equilibrium price, that is P1 received in the market, was more than what many of the producers were willing to accept for their products. Let's start with our analysis of tariff imposed by small country. We will analyze effect of tariff on small country as an example of demand and supply of United States bicycle market in two situations: first, without tariffs, and second, with tariffs. Let's first analyze the demand and supply of United States bicycle market without tariff. This is the graph that shows demand and supply curve of United States with free trade. If the world price is $300 per bike, with free trade, the demand is D0, that is 1.6 million bikes. And its local firm supply is S0, that is 0.6 million bikes. So 1.0 million bikes are imported, that is M0. Producer surplus is the area above the supply curve and below the market price line. With free trade, domestic producer surplus is the area CBA. And the domestic consumer surplus is the area FEC. Now we will analyze the impact on demand and supply of United States bicycle market when tariff is imposed. Let's suppose that the small country imposed 10% tariff on import of bikes, raising its price from $300 to $330. As small country does not impact world's product prices, foreign producers will keep on importing their bikes at $300. Following this, domestic producers will also raise the price of their same product from $300 to $330, leading to producer surplus of $30 on each bike, thus increasing their earnings. This graph shows the effect of a tariff on domestic producers. The $30 tariff on imports allows domestic producers to expand their production from S0 to S1. The $30 bike tariff gives domestic producers extra surplus on all the bikes they would have produced even without the tariff, an extra $30 x S0. With tariff, domestic producer surplus is area G plus A, the area below the new $330 price line and above domestic supply curve. We begin by examining the effects of an import tariff imposed by a small country, contrasted with free trade, using supply and demand within the importing country. Since foreign exporters do not change the price that they charge for the product, the domestic price of the imported product rises by the amount of the tariff, $30 in our example. Domestic producers competing with these imports can also raise their domestic prices as the domestic price of imports rises. Domestic producers gain when the government imposes a tariff on competing imports. They get a higher price for their products, they produce and sell a larger quantity, and they receive more producer surplus. Domestic consumers of the product are also affected by the imposition of the tariff. They must pay a higher price for both imported and domestically produced products, they reduce the quantity that they buy and consume, and they suffer a loss of consumer surplus. Tariff also adds to government's income. The government also collects tariff revenue, equal to the tariff rate per unit imported times the quantity that is imported with the tariff in place, less than the free trade import quantity. We thus have two domestic winners, domestic producers and the national government, and one domestic loser, domestic consumers, because of the imposition of a tariff. The effects of tariff on consumers, producers and government combined, can help in determining the net effect of tariff on importing country as a whole. The first key step is to impose a social value judgment. How much do you really care about each group's gains or losses? Anybody who expresses an opinion on whether a tariff is good or bad necessarily does so on the basis of a personal value judgment about how important each group is. To make any overall judgment, you must first decide how to weigh each dollar of effect on each group, which is done here by $1, one vote metric. To understand the net national loss from tariff, we must first understand what is $1, one vote metric, consumption and production effects. $1, one vote metric is the part of what consumers lose is matched by the gain to domestic producers, and another part is matched by the revenue gain to the government. The consumption effect of the tariff is the loss of consumer surplus for those consumers who are squeezed out of the market because the tariff artificially raises the domestic price, even though foreigners remain willing to sell the product to the importing country at the lower world price. The production effect of the tariff is the loss from using high-cost domestic production to replace lower-cost imports. The $1 one vote metric analysis for a small country shows a clear net loss to the importing country and to the world as a whole. It can also be seen that the dollar value of the consumer losses exceeds the dollar value of producer gains from the tariff. And the country's government also gains some tariff revenue. This graph shows net national loss from tariff for a small country. Consumer loss is shown by area A, B, C and D collectively, which equals minus $45 million. Negative value shows loss to consumers. Producer's gain is shown by area A, which equals $21 million. Government collects area C, which is $18 million. So, the net national loss from a tariff is shown by area B and D, which equals $6 million. For a small importing country, a tariff brings a net national loss. What it costs consumers is greater than what it brings producers plus the government's tariff revenue. Area B, the production effect, shows the loss from making it higher marginal cost. Area D, the consumption effect, shows the loss from discouraging import consumption. A question arises now that if tariff on imports ultimately leads to net national loss, why do impose tariff then? What are the benefits or value adds of tariff? Answer is provided by case study extension on page numbers 148 to 149 of your e-text. Let's discuss effect of tariff on large country. A large country is one whose import policies have effect on world product prices and which are mostly price makers. When a country has a power to affect the price at which the world importers supply imports, the country is said to have monopsony power. A nation with such power can exploit this advantage with an import tariff. In this case, a tariff has a terms of trade effect. Terms of trade is the ratio of the international price of our exports to international price of our imports. Let's imagine United States imposes a small tariff on bicycles. That tariff would make the price paid by United States consumers to be more than the price paid to foreign suppliers, which will result in U.S. importing fewer bicycles, thus foreign firms export fewer and produce fewer. Removing demand pressure on foreign production, marginal cost reduces. With lower marginal cost and weak demand, foreign firms will compete and lower their export prices, which will make U.S. gain as a nation from its own tariff. The graph shows the effects of a small tariff, in this case $6 per bicycle. In the market for bicycle imports figure, the $6 tariff increases the domestic price of imports to $303 and lowers the price charged by foreign exporters to $297. In the national market for bicycle figure, the rise in domestic price to $303 increases the domestic quantity produced to 0.62 million bikes and reduces the domestic quantity demanded to 1.58 million bikes. This slide shows the effect of tariff on the national well-being of United States. Consumer surplus increases by area A, B, C and D. Producer surplus increases by area A. The government collects tariff revenue equal to area C and E. The next questions that comes in our mind might be that is there a best tariff rate for the large importing country to impose, if it is purely driven by its own national well-being? The answer is yes, and such a tariff is called nationally optimal tariff. Nationally optimal tariff is the tariff that creates the largest net gain for the country imposing it. For a large country, it lies between no tariff and a prohibitively high one. The graph shows an optimal tariff for a large country. The nation's gains the price reduction equal to area E on foreign bicycle imports. This exceeds the nation's loss by reducing imports of bicycles, that is area B and D. The national gain, EBD, is greater than the national gain at any other tariff rate. Here, the nationally optimal tariff is $50 per bike and the importing country gains area E, area B plus D. A nationally optimal tariff is the tariff that creates the largest net gain for the country imposing it, assuming the rest of the world is passive. The optimal tariff rate, as a fraction of the price paid to foreigners, equals the reciprocal of the price elasticity of foreign supply of home country's imports. Danger: rest of world is worse off. Risk of retaliation by foreign country governments. Any questions?